conference, is not the way I speak at the family dinner table, is not the way I talk with my buddies I hang out with at the bar. And that's not a problem, right? It just shows that we can sort of switch contexts and switch vocabularies. When some of my friends who are enthusiasts about something that I know nothing about start talking, it's like they're speaking Greek. But that, I think, is a pretty natural human response. So I do want to encourage a pluralism, but what's important here is to recognize that there are, this is the part that I like about your comment, right? That there are many different ways of speaking, and that we want to be careful not to try to think that just because there's a standard English that we learn that that's the only way that people speak. Some might be better for some things than others. And if it turns out that standard English is better for conducting friendships, then that's going to give us reason to adopt that particular form. But I think that's an open question, and I sort of look forward to further investigation, further evidence to see whether there's a reason to prefer one kind of friendship, one kind of language rather than another in conducting friendship. Yeah.
I think when looking at this argument, you could argue that what that person gives online relationships as a value is intrinsically how it's valued. So I feel as if I value online relationships personally, but if per se I didn't value them, then they would inherently not be valuable, to me at least. So I think that it's relative to your position. So I think when arguing something like this, it's kind of futile to try and persuade people unless they keep an open mind about such topic.
Yeah, good. So it seems like it's absolutely true that it's going to be a necessary condition for friendships that we actually value the people and the ways of life that we share with them. And if we don't value it, then it's not the best form of friendship for us. And if we think back to Aristotle's distinction, right, when he runs through different kinds of friendship, we have utility friendships, we have pleasure friendships, and then he calls it virtue friendship, but the sort of way to cash that out that he gives is it's the good in itself friendship, and what makes each kind of friendship the kind of thing it is the way that we value it. If we value it for its usefulness, it's a utility friendship. If we value it for its pleasure, it's a pleasure friendship. If we value it as good in itself, it's a virtue friendship. And I think that's exactly in the spirit of the kind of move that you were making. If you can and do value some online activities that you share with people as good in themselves, then that is a virtue friendship, or at least has the appearance of one. And if you can't or if you don't find it good in itself to play games online or have conversations online, then yeah, online friendships aren't for you. That doesn't mean there's anything bad about what other people are doing.
Yeah.
That would be a further step. We need to say what's wrong about online interactions, but so far I haven't seen an objection that doesn't face an offline counterpart that I'm not willing to give up on.
Yes. Well, a person could argue that it's not valuable for them, but they couldn't necessarily argue that it's not valuable for other people.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
As long as it's not involving inherently self-harming, things, then I think it's perfectly fine.
That's right.
As long as it's between two consenting people and they're of appropriate age to establish a friendship.
That's very Aristotelian, just this kind of pluralistic approach, that the good life is not going to be the same for everybody. Maybe for me it's going to involve a lot more philosophy than for somebody who, that this isn't their cup of tea, but that's okay. We can have multiple ways to be good, and in order to say what's bad about it, we need a different kind of account that I haven't seen yet.
Yeah. You mentioned marriage at one point. If you're in a relationship with someone, would that, a non-Platonic relationship, I mean, that even sounds like philosophy, Platonic, Plato, but I'm not sure there's actually a connection there, is there? And what would Aristotle describe that as being?
Good question. So the term that Aristotle's using that we're translating as friendship is philia, which conveniently enough that PHIL here is the same at the beginning of philosophy. And it just means love. Not romantic love, that would have been something like eros for Aristotle, but like a care or concern for things. That can include a care or concern for knowledge and wisdom that we find in philosophy, but it's also an attitude we adopt towards an awful lot of people in our lives. Both are sort of people that we refer to as friends, but also more broadly, family members, romantic partners, spouses, kids, just sort of, so it's a broad net. And so when we translate philia as friendship, it helps to bear in mind that the kind of friendship he means is the inclusive kind. So let me say a bit more about that. When we use the word friend, sometimes we use that in contrast to other personal relationships. So we say, this is my friend, you have your friends, and then you have your family, or you have your friends, and then you have your boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife, or your friends and your classmates or something, make distinctions. But we also use the word friend inclusively. So I can say, my brother and I are best friends. Or I can say that, my husband and I are, have always been great friends. And that doesn't sound too strange, I don't think, to the ear, to think that our friends and our family and our romantic partners and so on can overlap. And it sounds like it's a good thing to say of someone who is also in another, related to us in another capacity, that they are also our friends. If I say my classmates are really good friends of mine, if I say my coworkers are really good friends, that seems to be saying something good about our relationship. So that's the sense in which I take Aristotle to mean philia, is to say that they are some kind of people we care about. That could include family, coworkers, classmates, etc. But furthermore, to say that someone is a good friend, I'm going to mention, is to say something good and intrinsically valuable about that particular relationship. Now, on marriage in particular, Aristotle says some interesting stuff about that. He says husbands and wives don't have to be virtue friends. They can be merely friends of utility and pleasure, but it's nice when they can pull it off. And I'm not, that's one of those places where I sort of read along. Aristotle says some occasionally quite sexist things. So I'm not sure I'm going to buy all of what he says about relationships.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, but there is a long tradition of folks who are much more friendly to feminism than Aristotle was, just sort of cutting that portion out. And the rest of the system actually works pretty well. So, he seems to have been a product of his time in that respect. And interestingly, one thing he says about marriage that I find really helpful is he says that in a marriage, the ideal is not two people who are exactly the same in all respects. Sort of mirror images of each other. What makes their shared life go well is that they bring different talents and different strengths.
Duality.
Complementarity to work together for a common end. And I think as a model of friendship more generally, that's actually a really nice move to make. To say that our other selves don't need to be mirror images of us, but that friendships in general can benefit from different people with different talents and different interests working together towards common ends. So just, I know we have a few comments that were, a few hands that were up here. Has anyone who hasn't made a comment yet, would anyone like to chime in? Yeah, jump.
How would you differentiate between a utility friend and a pleasure friend? Because couldn't you argue pleasure as utility?
Yeah, good. So one way to cash this out, we've used the term a little bit, is to say that good in itself is to say that it has intrinsic value, and both of these look like a term you may have encountered in some of your philosophy classes, that these look like friendships that have instrumental value. They're good as means to some further end, and so you could say that pleasure friendships are just a funny kind of use friendship because they involve using the other person to produce pleasure for you, or something like that. I think strategically Aristotle is fine with sort of making this split between the instrumental and intrinsic kinds of friendship, but practically he wants to point out that there's, for us, a difference between the people we don't actually find pleasant to be around, but have to sort of hold our noses and deal with anyway, because there are other uses, and the people that we do find enjoyable to be around, but don't necessarily think are very good people. And so practically speaking, it's useful to be able to sort of break them out in this way, and say, you know what, this is the person that is really useful, and I know I don't like them, and I don't enjoy spending time with them, but it's still good for me in some other way, versus these are the people it's fun to be around, I just have to remember they're not necessarily good in themselves. And I don't want to endorse this, but just to sort of show you some of the ways that Aristotle develops this in the text, He actually assigns different age ranges to these different kinds of friendships. And here's his story, and I seriously cannot distance myself enough from this, but I think it's funny enough that I have to share. He said old people tend towards utility friendships because they're pretty sour and unpleasant to be around and don't really like people.
He must not have been old yet when he wrote that.
Pleasure friendships he associates with the very young because they're constantly chasing the latest shiny thing, and their tastes are constantly evolving and their passions tend to overwhelm them. And then virtue friendships are characteristic of those in the prime of life. This is Aristotle doing social psychology, but it's, like I said, it's sort of cute enough I had to point that out. Yes?
What I think is interesting is that people can have such deep online relationships after they've dealt with real people all day.
Real people.
So I mean, you know, face to face, because I get up in the morning, I shower, I get ready, I look at myself in the mirror. I go to school, I work with my students, one-on-one. I work with parents. I go home, I work with my children. I hang out with my husband. And then I want to be alone. And I'm so surprised that people are constantly, this allows us to constantly be interacting. And to me, I don't know how people do it. I don't know. For me, that's very unattractive.
I suspect, I'm with you. I hit a point in the day where, you know, it's fun to hang out with people, but it needs some time to recharge. At the same time, we do know that different people sort of have different approaches to sociality.
Yes.
And different people have different kinds of jobs. So I suspect for people who have very interactive jobs that have a sort of high demand, that you do, I'm with you, you know, teaching, it's awesome, it's fun, but, you know, boy, is it socially sort of taxing. There were, you know, when I worked as a editorial staff, when I could go all day, I was in an office of like 2 other people, and I probably wouldn't see them if I was editing a manuscript all day, boy, then I would talk to people after that. So I think it, again, sort of, you know, a kind of healthy pluralism here. Different people are going to have different kinds of needs. Maybe there are some folks who can just kind of go all day and then go online and, you know, talk all night. More power to them, but it also seems like saying that friendship is an important part of a good life is not the same thing as saying it trumps everything else. It's important to balance all these different goals and aims. And friends are other selves. That means you need to take care of yourself too in order for the friendship to be successful. All right, any other folks who haven't had a chance to chime in yet? But I saw a place like back of the room. Yep, maybe not. Okay. Take it away.
I have a question. If a friendship is a virtue friendship, wouldn't it also contain attributes of that as a pleasure friendship or utility friendship?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Aristotle's line on this is, of course people who care about each other for their own sake are going to be pleasant and useful, but that doesn't exhaust the scope. There's this
Okay.
kind of additional reason behind it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would relate like a utility friendship between an employee and the employer. Like if you still have to be friendly with them, but you don't quite have to, you know, interact with them socially.
Yep.
You don't have to crave social interaction with them necessarily.
Exactly.
And you kind of have to stay professional in that sense.
Right, and that's a really nice kind of example because we can kind of come to grips with that concept that there's nothing wrong about being friendly and polite to people you don't personally like if that's what you need to do to get the job done. It's not dishonest, it's just recognizing that the good that you're after is not the good in themselves, but it's the thing that you're
Yeah, it's like a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't Aristotle have gotten it backwards, like the age range thing?
I don't know how to comment on.
I don't think it's a matter of age as much as a matter of surroundings.
Yeah.
That's true,
and-
that's true.
Right,
Environment.
right.
And maybe the tendency is for those people to be frail, so they rely on each other, the less frail ones. But there are some exceptions, because that's not, you know. Like I know a 91-year-old guy who still rides his bike everywhere and takes his
Yeah.
boat out and farms, so.
Right, right. And he does have this general approach where he makes sort of statistical announcements, like, you know, people tend to be this way, people tend to be that way, but that allows for lots of exceptions.
Yeah. I think he generalized it, which isn't a good thing when you're talking about people.
Well, maybe. I mean, one thing that he says about ethics generally and about social relationships or social issues is that we're not going to find very many hard and fast rules that are true no matter what. we are going to find tendencies. And it's useful to talk about those tendencies. We just have to remember that we're not dealing in absolutes anymore. As he puts it, we're dealing with premises that are only roughly, for the most part, true, and so we should expect conclusions that are no better. It doesn't mean we stop talking about general trends, but we remember there are always going to be exceptions, and we're just talking about the guidelines here, not the hard and fast principles.
Well, I was going to also object to the fact that Aristotle was a product of his time period, because it's actually, at the time, Greece was actually leaning more towards, leaning more towards the feminist movement when Aristotle came about, and he was considered conservative by today's standards.
Well, so fair enough, there were trends towards incorporating women, although even the sort of most feminist of the ancient Greeks of his day were pretty conservative by today's measures. So he fit within, and I guess that's what I mean by saying he was a product of his time. He was a conservative, but conservative today would be very different than conservative in his day. So within the scope, he sort of fit within the range of normal. But today, thankfully, women can do philosophy.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
We've moved past that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I might be, I had a question. I might be nitpicking over a wording, but
We
when
love
you were
nitpicking.
talking about the deceptiveness objection, I think, you know, you used the analogy of non-online relationships, and that that the possibility of deception does not either, I think, does it restrict
Let me see if I can
Personal-
get back to the slide, because it'll be helpful to look at the wording. Let's see here. This one?
yeah,
All right.
so the last one.
Limits.
Limits. But I thought about how, you know, it is, you know, oh, well, that's a thing. I was going to say that it's like illegal to, you know, say con someone.
Right, good. And it's illegal
but
to
there's a
con someone
difference
online.
between legality and morality.
Absolutely.
So that, I just thought of that.
Yeah, good.
But,
And it's true that I picked kind of an extreme example to introduce the term, and if that were the only place we had to worry about face-to-face deception, then I think that would be a significant difference. But in fact, I think that the kinds of techniques that con artists use are also in much less developed and much less predatory form, and just an ordinary feature of our exchanges. We frequently try to, you know, manipulate people.
Yeah, they're exploiting the bugs that are already there inherently.
Pretty much, and that's just something we do. If I, you know, really don't want to talk about something with somebody, I might, you know, make a really chipper face and say, you know, hey, have you heard about this other thing? And, you know, switch the conversation that way. Hey, is it deceptive? Well, yeah, but, you know, I didn't want to talk about it. So, you know, this isn't, that doesn't look to me any more inherently problematic, or it doesn't look like any less inherently problematic than posting my most attractive pictures on Facebook, you know, but that's just part of human interaction. We like to present our best selves. Maybe we ought to be more honest. Like, I don't want to come down as endorsing deception, but it's a difficult thing to do, and it's a difficult thing to do across platforms. And I don't think it's a special problem online. That's why the way I put it here is unless it limits face-to-face friendship, then it doesn't seem like a special obstacle. But yeah, that's a good place to challenge. Yeah.
Do you have any idea or any data showing how long an online friendship actually lasts?
That's a good question.
Is it a year, or do they go away after 6 months, or?
It's a good question. So I don't honestly know. One of the things that makes it difficult to read, and that I have sort of deliberately not separated out here, is many of our online friendships are also offline friendships. That there's a lot of overlap between the people we interact with online and the people we interact with offline. That didn't used to be true. It used to be the case that most online interactions were with people you didn't know face-to-face, and I think that was kind of an artifact of the fact that owning computers with access to the internet and having the interest to go out of your way was kind of a niche hobby, and so you weren't going to know that many people face-to-face relative to the people you could meet online. And part of the attraction was that if you were really into, bluegrass banjo playing, you could finally meet other enthusiasts because, it wasn't something that people in your hometown were likely to be into. But these days, given the ubiquity of social media, friendly devices, everybody has a cell phone, we're seeing a much greater shift towards a blurring of boundaries. So that's one reason it's difficult to tell us that we've got kind of a moving target in figuring out what online friendships are. The other thing, which I think is a little more difficult to measure, is that even if we got a statistical measure that, look, online friendships on average last 6 months, we need to say, well, what kind of friendships were they? And that's going to be really difficult to parse out. And we need to compare it to real life friendships and see how many of those last only 6 months, because we know that a lot of our friendships are pretty superficial, even though they're face-to-face as well. Aristotle does this nice job of kind of de-romanticizing most friendships. He says, look, we all like the ideal, but there aren't that many of them in any given person's life. We have lots of casual friendships, and that's not a bad thing, but we should also aim for this when and where we can, which is why I like to keep online friendships as one potential venue, even if it's not for everybody, because if it's so hard to make really good friends, why limit our options more than they should be?
Well, I mean, this deception thing too, I mean, that's anywhere you go in life. I mean, at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching them infomercials, they're nothing but deception.
Yes.
If you listen to the wording and actually watch what they're doing,
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like they're preying on people and nothing is done to regulate that just because they sell the truth in the super fine print.
Sure, and we know that people do all sorts of things just to manipulate or sort of persuade each other in different directions. We look at politics, look at advertising, maybe at certain religious leaders, not to sort of knock on religion generally, but some people who are in this kind of charismatic capacity are going to mislead people for their own ends. Teachers, lots of different people can engage in this sort of careful, skillful use of people's sort of emotional levers. And it's not unique to the internet.
No, but it's crafty. It's
Yeah.
at its root. I mean, it's downright underhanded.
Right. And that's why I think in some ways the fact that we can actually trace paper trails online has been kind of interesting, because it makes it harder to pull off at least certain kinds of scams, because you have to assume people are going to talk to each other in a way that you couldn't before. It's not perfect, it's not foolproof, we still have to worry about deception online, but it is an important check.
But it's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, constantly thinking of it, protect yourself. Because I'm not saying that 6 months down the road that somebody gets mad at you and posts every private conversation you had on a website somewhere.
Yeah. No, and that does look like a really important vulnerability. I mean, it's not a new one in some senses. If you look at sort of 18th and 19th century novels, there are all these cases where somebody waits until something gets lost out and then they release all their private letters. But it is something that, because so many of our conversations are documented, it is something to keep in mind. Maybe the good news is, if everyone's dirty laundry can be aired like that, we'll be a little more tolerant of people's slip-ups occasionally, but there are going to be some early casualties, and that seems like a risk of greased information and online communication. Well,
I have a question. I've been wanted to get your thoughts about it, and I'm going to call this the parasitism objection.
excellent.
The parasitism objection. And that in reading your paper, I was noticing that, right, there's analogs to offline things. So, concerns about commercialization, you've got the friends going out to trivia night. Okay, what occurs to me is that the friends who go to trivia night are friends outside of trivia night as well as in trivia night.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the analogs that you rely upon to try to refute the objections depend upon friendships that exist outside, offline. And so I was thinking about, okay, it's the comic book guy objection. Okay, so take comic book guy who spends all of his time in the basement of his comic book shop, and he has no interactions with human beings out in the real world. All of his friendships are online. Okay, is comic book guy missing something? Suppose you had an online friend who you knew only online, the entirety of their friendship, and your online friend, after many years go by, dies, and you go to his funeral and you suddenly think, gosh, I wish I'd gotten to meet so-and-so.
Right.
Would you think that you had missed something by never meeting so-and-so? The parasitism objection is that it seems like if there are virtue friendships available online, that their value somehow is derived or is parasitic on offline friendships.
Couldn't you almost argue like a mind-body problem with that?
I'm not sure what you mean, John.
Like, so you've never met him like physically,
Mhm.
you know, but you've been, you know, interacting with him as a person for the past, you know, however many years. So, you know, to say, you know, that, you know, you never met him in person, you know, like, you know, physically, yet still like.
Well, yeah, so you might be thinking like, is there any necessity of physicality for that's, and so it's just sort of similar, I think, to Alexis's physicality objection too.
Looking back now.
Yeah, good. So I think I would like to split this into three separate pieces and see if we can deal with them individually, although I suspect there is kind of a core concern behind them, and see if dealing with them individually addresses the core motivating concern.
Whatever that happens to be, I'm not exactly sure myself, but I'm just like...
Good. So I have a variation on the comic book guy, actually, that a friend, a student, actually gave to me yesterday when I was running this as a dry run for my classes. And this guy is very close friends online with a young woman who is of a very religious family, and her father will not let her out of the house without supervision, and he says he's only met her twice, but he considers her to be a very good friend of his, and they have this great relationship online, and her life is otherwise severely restricted by these religious guidelines. She can't wait until she's old enough to actually get out of the house, but in the meantime, the internet is a lifeline for her because she can actually talk to people. Yes, I think her life is missing something. And so to sort of tie into the earlier stuff, I think saying that any given friendship is not missing something because it lacks the physical interaction element is not to say that a life without any interaction is A-okay. I think that there is something missing for comic book guy, and there's something missing in this girl's life. But that doesn't mean that any given person has to be a source of that, just like, maybe your life is better with some workout buddy or other, but it doesn't mean you need to work out with all of your friends.
Sure, right, I recognize that there's a possible logical fallacy there of assuming that having no offline friendships, you'd be missing something, does not mean that there's something wrong with individual online friendships. But that pushes me towards the parasitism thing, perhaps. Yeah.
Good. So so that's my response to this. I think yes, there is something missing, but it's not something necessarily missing here. For the online-only friend's funeral, and interestingly, a case like this was presented actually as evidence of the richness of online friendship. This was by the Finnish guy again. I don't know if I should be telling this. He gave it as an example in a conference. I guess it's fair game. Okay, so he had an online friend for years and years, and they've organized all kinds of things together. He's this sort of very active person on a number of different fields. And he said the day that he heard that this guy had died, he was across the world, and he just saw it on the forums they were on, and he's like, I don't cry for anybody. I went into a bar and I just cried for hours for this guy. So he was devastated. He didn't report saying, I wish I got to meet this guy in person. What he missed was the guy in the relationship that they actually had. So I don't think it's in principle impossible to say of somebody, gee, I wish I got to meet them in person. But I can say, gee, I wish we got to go to the movies or what have you. And again, that doesn't mean that the friendship was any worse because it was missing this other dimension. And I think that online-only relationships can be powerful enough that they can affect us, even if we're normally, pretty stoic types. So that brings us to parasitism. Okay, so I'm trying to carve it up and take one piece at a time. So the parasitism objection, if I can just rephrase it, make sure I've got it, is that in my other examples, we're friends with these people in other capacities as well, and this is merely one venue in which we sort of practice our friendship. What about online friends? Well, first, many of our online friends are also our offline friends. So the fact that we talk on Facebook doesn't sort of, in prima facie, give us reason to think we don't also hang out in other venues. So in those cases, it looks like the parasitism objection isn't going to be a problem. There are, however, friendships that take place pretty exclusively online. Of those, I want to say a couple of things. First, even if you interact with somebody online, it's not the case that you need to use some particular platform. So you might use different media to communicate in different ways. So it's not the case that you're tied to some particular, you need not always interact on Facebook, right? You can also hook up with them on Twitter and Snapchat and, connect on, I don't know, whatever apps people use in these days. It's constantly evolving field and I'm always scrambling to catch up. So that looks like, and some of them are going to be commercial and some are probably going to be open source or otherwise nonprofit. And if it bugs you that someone's always making money off of that exchange, there are other ways you could go. The other way is just to say, well, we do have some friends that we mostly see in some particular context. I have friends who, when I see that friend is when we sit down together to play board games. I care about these people in other capacities, but that's what we do as friends, is we get together and we put out a big bowl of chips and we just play board games for a few hours. And that doesn't seem to me like a problem either, and the fact that somebody's making money off of it doesn't then give me any more reason to be skeptical of it. We happen to play board games in our houses because we're cheap, but but that's a reason to use social media, right? If somebody else is willing to host the event in exchange for selling advertising space, they're still the ones paying. So that may not have actually addressed it, but that's my attempt to at least refute the.
No, I still have my worry here because it still seems like there's, right, the friends that just come over to your house and they play games and that sort of stuff. It's confined to a single activity, but still it's offline. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to cleave between the online and the offline. And it still is seeming to me that the online friendships, if they can be virtue friendships, somehow, are deriving some of the possibility of being virtue friendships simply because one has offline friendships. Not necessarily with them, but one has offline friendships as well.
So what's the value we're trying to narrow down here?
I think the value has to do with the value of the online friendship itself as a virtue friendship. Okay. That those can be of value as virtue friendships only because, good in themselves, only because you have offline friendships as well. And then if you lost all of your offline friendships,
yep.
the